So this is something that I've worked on in a different space around kind of thinking about organizing and movement building in a digital age. What's special about it? Why is it such a big deal? And I think it's a big deal, and it's becoming even more of a big deal now, especially in COVID. I think I remember, I don't know who was saying it, in that we feel very stuck, no? Like we usually do our things and our organizing in person, and now we feel more and more increasingly we have to somehow figure out how we're going to do the same things online. Uh, so a couple of things. One is we are already doing it, but maybe we just don't, we haven't quite fully embraced and folded it into one of our spaces of organizing, but we already in some way or another do our organizing online. And what it does is it helps us to then think about space quite differently. So we have the space that is interacting. So I really like that example about Pakistan. So you're kind of like rupturing multiple spaces at the same time. Your action is always thinking about a space that's connecting the offline and the online. You may be occupying a physical space that generally your body, the particular body that you have, the very fact that you are there is rupturing to that space, no? And this is why sometimes also a backlash happens. And especially if you're doing a lot of queer organizing, or if you occupy kind of like gender queer body, you also realize that sometimes by mere presence, you are rupturing the status quo. And a few things can happen because of that. One is you're kind of expanding this notion of space in terms of what is allowable or not. Or two is you can also get a certain amount of backlash, and this is where campaigning and allyship is really important to kind of also prepare for this moment. But the idea is that the space in which you organize, you outreach, you make change, and where change happens is both digital and physical, and that your body is the connecting point between the online and the offline. And you have to kind of imagine solidarity in all of these different spaces. And then secondly is that when you organize online, you have a much larger constellation of actors than you maybe originally think of. So when somebody said like, oh, I'm not sure if there's stakeholders involved because the campaign, Vashti, because the campaign is only now emerging, but you've already named several stakeholders. You've named the people who are in Gen Z, millennials who are feeling themselves very invested in this campaign. You're also mentioning like, different people who are already starting to pay attention to it. So I think like this expansion of a constellation of actors in our organizing is quite an important one to pay attention to when we do stakeholder mapping. Because often we only pay attention to the usual suspects, NGO organization, or advocates, or maybe policymakers, or maybe the media, and so on. But in digital, when we fold in the digital into our thinking of what we are doing and organizing, actually there are also all of these other actors that we work with all the time, but maybe we don't see them as part of our organizing network. So for example, social media activists, people who are always hanging out in social media, who's doing a lot of their engagement and organizing online, and who's always coming up with different campaigns. And sometimes we know it, sometimes you don't, sometimes you participate in it, sometimes we don't, right? So kind of like social media activists is a big piece of that. Nerd collectives, I quite like. So it's people who are very, very nerdy about particular topics, and then they can get activated and mobilized into action for specific issues. So they could be gamers, or they could be designers, or they could be people who are interested in history or something, or comic book or fan fiction club people. They're already organized and they are in a group, and they also have like particular political issues that they can then be engaged with as a kind of ally or as part of the movement, because they also occupy the same space. And free radicals are the ones that I feel is kind of important to pause, and we may not, we don't always are aware of them being part of our organizing. And they are basically the kind of individuals who connect between the informal organizing and the formal organizing. So they are, often facilitators, trainers, organizers, the people who are translators or documenters, and so on and so forth. So they are the ones who move from movement to movement, from space to space, and they help to make those particular kinds of connections. And I just wanted to expand this idea of the constellation of actors before we get into our next exercise. But just to say there is something quite promising and moving around kind of how change happens. And when we think about campaigning in an online and offline in the current age, not to separate it too much, not to think that, oh, there is the online and then there is the offline and this one is real and that one is just a tool and it doesn't really affect anything, but to be very aware that the digital is actually an increasingly critical public domain. It's a public domain that a lot of people in power are very aware of and that they put a lot of energy and resources in trying to control. We are in the age of narrative and meaning making. And I think for queer organizing, especially, we know that we are always trying to transform and activate. And the site of contestation, the site of our activism, a lot of it is around meaning making, no? Like we're trying to also expand the idea of the notion of gender, the notion of family, or the notion of citizenship, so on and so forth. So the online space is a very, very fertile space for this. And there is no other time, historical timeline for us where we are able to directly tweet a person in power and say, hey, what are you doing about this and that? Every single politician and head of state is somehow on a social media space or has a social media presence. If you think about it, this is a very new democratic moment. And every single country, I think, in Southeast Asia has millions of dollars in budget uh, to try and control this space. Indonesia has Buzzer RP, Malaysia has Cyber Trooper. I don't know too much about how it's organized in Vietnam or in Thailand. I know that Philippines Duterte has a budget. So pretty much every single government has like a budget allocated to controlling this particular space. So that's kind of, that's what we're talking about. That's kind of like the thing that is at stake. And that's what's really useful for us to also try and connect as we are organizing to see how is our online work organizing connected to offline transformation and vice versa. That's right. And if you see what's happening with kind of like TikTokers and what they're doing with taking over online spaces with hashtag and with their content, it's incredible. It's like really cool tactics that we can also learn from.